Hello, everyone. My name is Mariana, and I'm an educator at the Natural History Museum of Utah. And today I'll be leading our question and answer part of the Research Quest Live. So welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to have everybody watching today. Today we'll talk with Dr. Mitchell Power, the creator of the Garrett Herbarium and paleobotanist at the Natural History Museum of Utah, and it's also part of the Uinta Mountains Investigations. If you're having our classes with us, you probably have seen him a lot this week. I'm sure I have. And so hello, Michelle. Thank you so much for participating. How are you today?
Hi, Mariana. I'm doing great. Nice to be here. I'm excited for some more challenging questions today.
Yay, that's awesome. So I think it would be really cool if you can start explaining your research. I know that your research includes like traveling a lot to different parts of the world. So I would like you to start explaining for our viewers, how does it work?
Sure. I love to talk about my research, so thank you. So I have several really fun projects I'm doing right now, which includes work in the Uinta Mountains, but I'll just mention a couple of the more distant projects first. So I have a graduate student, Susanna, and she is from Colombia in South America. And she came to Utah really interested in biological diversity in Colombia. And so we're doing a study together, looking at several sites in the Andes Mountains of Colombia. And we're trying to measure the changes in diversity as you go from the lowland rainforest, the real kind of jungle atmosphere, to the very high, plateaus where it's mostly grasses in the alpine of the Andes. And so we're looking at how the diversity changes. And one of the interesting things we want to study in South America is, do people have a role in keeping diversity? And, many of your viewers may have heard, about some of the conflicts in Colombia. And we wonder, when there's land that is contested or conflict land, does it actually protect biodiversity? So we're looking at, the numbers of different types of species, from lowland to the highlands. And then I have a kind of quite a different project we're doing now in Ethiopia. So I get to travel to South America, and then I get to travel to Ethiopia most summers. Of course, this summer, there won't be any travel, unfortunately. But in Ethiopia, we're working with a team of archaeologists, and they're really interested in a past civilization that has completely disappeared. And so it was several thousand years ago. There was big cities, and they even developed their own coin. It was one of the first coins presented by this kingdom called the Aksum Kingdom. And so we're studying what happened. Why did this civilization disappear? So as a paleobotanist, I get the job to look for fossil plants and charred plant material in the soils and try to find out, did they overexploit their forest? Did they cut all the trees down and kind of run out of resource? Or we don't really know what happened. Maybe it was a little bit of climate change, a little bit of warfare, a little bit of drought. So it's kind of an interesting mystery. So those are kind of some neat projects I get to do, off North America, when we're not in a travel restriction. And then, my day-to-day work at the museum, we are collecting lots of plants from these different project areas. We are always, stumped with mystery IDs, trying to figure out plants that have been sitting on shelves for years. We study a lot of, small fragments of plants. So sometimes we don't know exactly, where a seed came from, or where a broken twig or a leaf came from. So we try to match it with our collections. And it's very much like a crime scene investigation, where we just have bits of evidence, and then we try to reconstruct what we find from these little pieces, fragments.
That's so cool. It looks like you have a lot of projects, and I can say that I feel really excited about your project in South America. I'm also from South America, so I think that's really, really cool and really important now. Yeah. And I would also like to remember everybody who's watching, before we continue, that if you have a question for Dr. Mitchell, please press the ask a question button or leave a comment on Facebook because we are getting all of your questions. And I would also like to ask you, because last week we had Alec and Rob here like answering our questions as well. And they talked a little bit about how it was like recording the videos, like how I was doing like the script for the videos for the Research Quest winter investigations. And I know that you were there. So I would like to know if you can talk a little bit about your part, like your experience doing those videos, and if you had like any story you would like to share about this moment.
Yeah. So it was scary for me. And as a teacher, you know, I often stand in front of my students and have to present material. And to me, that feels very comfortable. But for some reason, when somebody is recording every word you're saying, it feels like a lot of pressure on you to say exactly the right thing. And so you know, it's funny because I grew up in a family of theater people. So my dad is a professor of theater, and some of my brothers were actors. And so I thought, oh, this will just be, you know, part of my family tradition. But I was really nervous, and I was nervous because, you know, when your words are entombed in video, you know, whether you make mistakes or you say extra ums, or, you know, you fidget, you know, all these little things that we do, we don't recognize until you're on video. So it was quite intimidating to do that. But of course I had, you know, these amazing people to work with, and they helped me through this process of, you know, facing my own fear of being on camera. And we just had a blast. I mean, we had a lot of laughs. And, you know, when you make like a language mistake, if I would, you know, misspeak or kind of say the wrong cue at the wrong time, they made it into more of a joke and a kind of funny moment rather than a lot of pressure. So I learned a lot from the process, and I have a completely new respect for actors now and people that have to stay on script. And I have this problem where I tend to wander in my communication, my thinking when I'm talking to my students. And they didn't want me to do that in the videos. They really want the video to be specific for whichever content and question we were talking about. So yeah, it was really challenging. But you know, I was in good hands, and I think it was the team that made it such an incredible experience. And so I would do it again. I can't believe I just said that, but
Ooh.
It was really pretty special and neat to see that process. You know, everything from teleprompters to lighting to, you know, making sure my collar was straight, and you know, the thing that doesn't translate on the videos is it was freezing cold out there. And so
That's what I heard.
if students could tell with Isabel and myself, but our lips were often blue. And so we were just freezing because we shot much of this in the late fall. And so we would try to do jumping jacks and things when we weren't on camera, so we weren't shivering when we were trying to speak. So yeah, it was a really fun process.
It was like working out and doing the videos at the same time. Yeah, I heard about that you had like also like some weather situations, like it was like really wet, and so I can imagine. Yeah, and I can totally understand how making videos it's hard. I am totally respecting much more journalists and everybody who does like live videos now. I know that everybody in my team is. That's so cool.
Yeah, the professionals make it look so easy, and then I recommend to students out there, try to make a short video clip at home and show it to your parents, and you'll probably hate the way you look on video at first, you know, but eventually we get used to it. But it is challenging. It's a neat skill that I have a newfound respect for.
Yeah, but yeah, you look really good in the videos, and you did an amazing job. And Alec and Rob, they were saying like how great you were like in the videos. So awesome.
It was just a great team. It really was. Yeah.
You're great. So today in the class, our investigation class, we talked about a little bit about case studies. So can you tell us about a time you used a case study in your Uinta Mountain research, maybe?
So like some of my own research, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so one of the things we're interested in the Uinta Mountains is the role of wildfire. And so we have an idea about wildfire from previous work by other people. And so the idea is that there should be more wildfires happening in the low elevation than in the high elevation. And so we've been studying fires from soil samples from the very low elevation to the high elevation. And as you go back through soil, it's like a history of fires, and we find layers of burnt plant material. And so we had this idea that, okay, we should expect more evidence of fire in the low elevation than we would see in the high elevation, because at high elevation you have snowpack, right? And the snow will stay longer in the year. It has colder temperatures. There's just more water. So you just shouldn't have as much dry conditions for fire. And then, we thought the low elevation won't have as much snow, should dry out quickly. Well, it turns out what we found is the middle elevation has the most fire. So it wasn't the low elevation, it gets too dry. And once it's too dry, you can't grow grasses and the shrubs don't grow as much. And so you don't have a lot of fuel. But at the high elevation, you have the problem of too wet, too much snow, too cool. But the mid elevation is like the, it's like the Goldilocks. It's, not too hot, not too cold, just right. You grow a lot of trees and shrubs and grasses. So it's all it takes is a little bit of drying and it becomes very flammable. So that was really a neat study I've been working on with a graduate student, kind of studying these ancient fires and looking at the history of wildfires in the Uinta Mountains through these like burnt plant remains.
That's really interesting. Thank you, Richard. I was surprised. We got a question like related to the investigation as well. So Shelby from Logan, and it's related to what you're talking as well. Okay. She's asking, why would the mountain pine beetle population go up in extreme drought? And we got some questions about like how the drought was like, how they were not expecting the impact that the drought had like in the population. So yeah, if you can talk a little bit about that as well.
Sure. It's a really good question. And the main challenge we see as the pine beetle populations increase is that there's no mechanism or there's no cause to reduce their population, right? And the way you reduce the pine beetles is you have to have extremely cold temperatures in the winter. And so what we think is probably the stronger control on the population size is the minimum winter temperatures. So as winters become milder, and when I say milder, it's really for pine beetle mortality. So to kill beetles that are basically laying dormant underneath the bark through the winter, you need 2 weeks of very cold temperature. And we're getting less and less opportunities to kill back populations. So part of the story is that winter minimum temperature. It's not reducing the number of pine beetles. And then what happens is they are kind of getting a longer opportunity to reproduce. So we can now look at the numbers of times they go through their reproductive cycles. And it's on average, it's about 1.5 to 2 times per year, because spring comes earlier and summer lasts longer and winter comes later. So they have a bigger window to grow their population because of global temperatures warming. And so that's kind of an interesting challenge, is because we know these are natural populations, and it's not like an introduced beetle from another continent. They've been here a long time. How long? We don't exactly know. Some of my colleagues at the university, they study old soils and they look for evidence of bark beetles, but they're really hard to find, the fossil bark beetles. There was one study, I think in Montana, where they found some bark beetles about 6,000 years ago. So we know they've been here for thousands of years. But we just don't know, what will happen as we move into milder winters. And the problem for trees and why trees can suffer so much is that when they become drought stressed. So if we have a summer without a lot of rainfall, and trees need that moisture to keep photosynthesizing and storing sugar and doing their work, when they become drought stressed, they're more vulnerable to the beetles. because, you know, a very healthy, well-watered tree, if a beetle or any kind of insect crawls onto the bark and starts to drill into it, the tree gets a signal to send sap and flush that beetle out. So if you have a lot of water, you can pump out sap and you can try to defend yourself by getting these beetles all sticky and flushing them out. But when you're drought stressed, you can't. And then, you know, there's one other kind of interesting piece there is some of the students might have learned about the blue stain fungus.
Mm-hmm.
And so the blue stain fungus is actually, some of the researchers think it's carried on the beetles themselves. And so when the beetles go in, they start to bore into the trees, they infect it with the blue stain fungus. And what the researchers are thinking now is that it sends a signal to the tree, the blue stain fungus, that basically everything's fine. So don't worry about making sap and flushing out these holes. Everything's fine. Just pretend we're not here and you'll be fine. But it's tricking the tree. And so it's a really neat, you know, and the blue stain, it's really just you know, one of these incredibly talented mushrooms that can sneak around inside the cambium, inside under the bark layer, and cause a whole bunch of problems for the tree.
That's so interesting, and it's so interesting for everybody who's watching to understand how things are so connected and so complex. Yeah, that's awesome. And I want to remind everybody who's watching, so please, if you have a question, just press the ask a question button or leave a comment on Facebook for us. And now I would just want to come back a little bit, and we said in the beginning that you are a paleobotanist, right?
Right.
So can you explain to us a little bit of what is it? What do you do?
Sure. So so paleobotany is a pretty fun field of study. And so I had to learn a lot of botany to get to the paleobotany part. But to do paleobotany, you also have to have some background in geology, and you have to know something about geography, and you have to know something about soils. And so a lot of my work is trying to interpret ancient soils through tiny fossils, and mostly I study pollen. And so plant pollen, which is produced by, you know, trees and shrubs in vast quantities. I'm sure all your students out there have been to a lake in the summer that has, you know, sometimes we call it the yellow scum on the surface of the lake. Well, that's all like beautiful pollen in my mind. And so that pollen, it settles into the bottoms of lakes and settles into soils, and it's incredibly resistant to decay. So my main research task is to go out and find these old pollens, and then we have to chemically treat the sample, which has some soil in it and some usually there's like silica from rocks, and so we combust all of that out, and what's left in the end are these beautiful grains of pollen. And so I recommend students to go on to the internet and look up pollen, and there's so many shapes and sizes, and we call them morphologies. And so each plant produces a different looking pollen. And so we can use that to link, who has lived here in the past, and when did they come, and when did they go, and why. And so so a lot of our kind of research is focused on these little tiny fossils. And so even though you can see that yellow film on a lake, you can't see pollen with your eye. You have to use a microscope. So I spend a lot of time looking at the world at 400 to 600 magnification. And it's a beautiful world. So if you haven't had a chance, spend some time at this very small scale of the world, and you'll learn all kinds of neat things.
That's awesome. That sounds really, really cool. I think I want to do that. So we have some other questions about the investigation to ask you. I have Callie from Taylorsville in Utah. She's 12 years old, and she's asking, in the winter investigation, the aspen and the pine grass populations go up when the wolves are added. How do the populations of the producers benefit from a tertiary consumer?
Yeah, Callie, that's exactly what we were hoping you would ask. So, the best example we have of this, interlinked system is from Yellowstone National Park. And so we, Yellowstone did this experiment where they introduced wolves back in the 90s. And some researchers there thought, well, if we introduce wolves, they will eat some of the old elk and they'll help us maintain this very large and growing elk population. What they didn't realize is that it wasn't just a predator-prey change, it was a behavior change. So the wolves put pressure on the elk. So the elk in Yellowstone, before wolves, they could just lounge around, they could eat grass all day, they could hang out by the rivers, and they could eat the baby aspen trees. And what that did is it removed a lot of the trees and shrubs around the streams. And so those streams began to heat up because they weren't in the shade anymore. And the elk were just being very, what we call complacent. Well, you bring in the wolves and then you have nervous elk. And nervous elk is really the answer to part of Callie's question. Because when you have herbivores that have to move all the time, they can't stay in one spot, they can't overgraze, you start to see other species respond. And so Yellowstone, we saw aspen trees came back, willow trees came back, some of the pine grass came back, and this was because elk became nervous. And it wasn't even predation. It wasn't direct predation. It's just they became nervous, and it became more like the natural system should be, where animals are moving their range all the time and getting into safer places where they are more comfortable, and then they'll move again. And so it's a lot of what we call behavioral ecology rather than the direct predator-prey type of linkage. I mean, the other really neat part of the Yellowstone story is there's a native trout, the Yellowstone cutthroat trout. And that cutthroat trout also came back. And the reason it came back because the streams were getting too warm for the trout. But when the elk started to move around more and stop eating the stream side vegetation, the shading came back. And when the shading came back, the stream temperatures came down and it restored the trout habitat. And so the ecologists had no idea all of these things would happen. All of these intricate pieces of the ecosystem would come together. It was really a surprise. And so that, in a long answer is kind of how pine grass and aspen can come back with wolves moving in. You just start to scatter the herbivores and make them a little more mobile and a little more nervous.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, because you also answered that. We also had a question from Chloe from Draper. She was asking, how could a wildlife cause some populations of animals to increase? And that's awesome. Your example answered that as well. And we also got a question about animal food chain. Easy from Riverton is asking, even though a moose is a vegetarian, why isn't it at the top of the food chain because of its large size?
Interesting question. Yeah, so think of food chains as transfer of energy, right? And so you go from the primary producers, the plants that can photosynthesize from energy from the sun, and that's the base. And then you have your herbivores that eat those plants. And then above the herbivores, you get your carnivores. So you put the moose in there, and the moose is this giant animal. Well, there are natural predators of moose, and some of those natural predators are the large carnivores, wolves and mountain lions can attack moose, even bears will. But an adult bull moose, most predators won't attack. And so for many animals in these food, we like to call them food webs because it's often not linear, right? They, species can be generalist rather than specialist. But many predators won't necessarily attack adult prey species. They'll go after juveniles or young, the young or the very old, which may be weakened because of an old injury or deep snowpack. So she's really right in that, why the moose isn't at the top of the food chain. Well, effectively, it has enough body mass and defense to protect itself. And it would take, really an organized pack of wolves to bring down a full-grown, healthy adult moose. But that's, this is why we love to see these systems like Yellowstone with all of the animals back in them, because what the wolves do in the Yellowstone example is they take out the weak and the old and the injured animals to feed themselves and their puppies, while the strong and healthy ones can continue to live. So yeah, there's a lot of really well-armed herbivores out there, from bull elk to giant moose, that you really, even as a strong predator, you wouldn't want to mess with.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much. I have a question from Malcolm from San Diego. He's asking, how long has the mountain pine beetle infestation been happening?
Yeah, so the really big ones that we've seen recently have just been the last couple of decades, in the late 90s and then the early 2000s, where we've seen these explosions in the Western United States. If you look into some of the evidence in British Columbia, Canada, they've had really massive eruptions. I think it was 2003 and 2006. So the really big ones are recent. But like I said just a few minutes ago, is that we know they've been here for thousands of years. And we have, a little fossil evidence that, at least 6,000 years and likely for, tens of thousands of years. And so they've been around a long time. And now, what we're seeing is the question is, are the scale of the outbreaks, are they what we call unprecedented? So is this like a situation that is not normal? The widespread mortality and the infestations, killing hundreds of thousands of trees. And we don't know, scientists don't know, which, that's the cool thing about working in the sciences, is there's a lot of questions that are hard to answer. And so that's a hard question to answer in terms of, how long, and then, this recent outbreak, how different is it from something that might have happened, hundreds of years ago or even thousands of years ago. So yeah, it's I don't have a I don't have a great answer, except that there's a lot of people trying to figure out if the recent outbreaks are really different, and we know they've likely been here for thousands of years.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much. And we don't have a lot of time, but I have a final question. Aiden from Salt Lake City is asking, in our investigation, we are seeing decreasing populations of species. When I think of decreasing in species, I think I have to save them from extinction. Are we going to get involved to save the species, or do we let them, the nature run its course? And that connects to another question that is like, how can students be involved with natural sciences? Natural sciences.
So good questions. So scientists for a long time, through studying fossils, have looked at extinction. And what we understand is that extinction just happens, right? We call it background extinction. And that's just the normal process of species spending some time on the planet, and then they go extinct. And so, there's some estimates out there that the average time a species is on the planet is like 1 to 2 million years. And so then they eventually go extinct and they get replaced with something else. The problem today is it's captured in this idea of the 6th extinction. So we know in Earth's history, there's been 5 really big extinction events, and that this 6th extinction is caused by humans changing the landscape. So from our, urban developments and highway systems, and, pulling resources out of forest systems like timber and mining. And so we're taking away habitat for species, which is accelerating how quickly species go extinct. So there is an acceleration, and we call this the 6th extinction. And so, I recommend students take a look at the 6th extinction. There's some really neat videos out there and some books on it. And so, learn about, what are the causes, and a lot of it's related to human activity. And then, what can we do about it? Like, well, how do we kind of become empowered here? And so, one of the things is diversity is a buffer against extinction, right? So, like the bark beetles killing the lodgepole pine. Well, if the Uinta Mountains were only lodgepole pine, it would be devastating. But we also have Douglas fir trees, we have aspen trees, we have spruce trees, we have subalpine fir trees. So when you have more diversity, when species are under attack, other species can fill in, and they still provide, the spot for the woodpecker to come and drill a hole and make its nest. And they provide sites for, a habitat for animals to graze. And so diversity is one way to protect against extinction. So like just around my house, I have a problem with my aspen trees. They're being attacked by aspen borer. So I'm planting other species. So I'm planting pine trees and spruce trees. So that's what I do. I try to diversify the system. And then, I think the other thing to do is many of our partners in the zoo industry are very committed to conservation, and they have animals from all over the world, and they highlight some of the problems with certain species. So, you can go to your local zoos and find out what kinds of conservation activities they're doing to help protect endangered species. And so that's a really useful thing to do too. And yeah, so I would say go for as a diverse approach as possible. Help combat extinction and learn what the causes are.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Knowledge. Yeah, that's why we love doing this Q&A with like scientists and everything, because then like everybody can get some knowledge and learn more about that and learn more about what they can do. Yeah. That's awesome.
Exactly.
So we are out of time. So I just wanted to continue, but we are. So thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell, for participating today. That was awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's always fun to be on Research Quest. And, if as we open up the museum again, for any of these local students, come in and see us. We're always happy to show you guys the labs, and I'd even show you some, microscopic pollen on a microscope if you come in. So.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That would be really cool. And for everybody who's watching, I want to thank you all for watching. I want to remind everybody that tomorrow at 9:30 a.m. Mountain Daylight Time, we have a special guest interview with Ellen Erickson. She's our museum citizen science program specialist, and she's going to talk to us about that. So please tune in and watch with us. And thank you so much for participating. And bye, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you.